Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Thursday Morning Torah. This morning is Parshat Bo, and it is, as you will know shortly, it is the second portion of the book of Exodus, and it covers all the plagues remaining except for the last one. And we're going to talk about one of the plagues this morning, and also about the very difficult and knotty conundrum of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And why would Pharaoh be considered culpable if God hardens his heart? So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to move on to one of the plagues that I want to discuss in greater detail. But let's start with Pharaoh. So Pharaoh is a sort of interesting character in the story of the Exodus, because he doesn't maintain a consistent, I'm never going to let them go, and that's it. There's not this wall of anger and distance that you might expect. He's more humanized than that, if you will. There are times when he lets them go, and then he regrets letting them go and pulls them back, or promises to let them go and then doesn't let them go. And remember that according to the story, Moses grows up in Pharaoh's house, even though there is no indication in the exchanges between them that Pharaoh knows Moses from earlier encounters. Nonetheless, it makes the story of Pharaoh much more ramified, complicated, and interesting than it would be were Pharaoh just this unyielding and unidimensional character. And one of the things that makes it so interesting is that several times God is said to harden Pharaoh's heart, but also, I believe an equal number of times, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So one of the explanations for God's hardening Pharaoh's heart is that God just leads you in the direction that you already want to go. And since Pharaoh wished to be obstinate, God helped Pharaoh be obstinate. Another explanation is that God just gave Pharaoh the strength to make an independent decision, because the enormity of the plagues, which would make it virtually impossible for a human being to make their own decision, meant that Pharaoh couldn't decide on his own. He would have been overwhelmed by the awfulness of enduring these plagues, were it not for the fact that God gave him the strength to stand independently and make his own decision as Pharaoh. So that is another way of seeing the very perplexing hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Either way you see it, it still raises the inevitable question, which of course is constant through the Bible, not only in the story of the Exodus, but in many other stories, which is that God has already told Abraham hundreds of years before that your people are going to be slaves in Egypt, and I'm going to bring them out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And obviously none of that works if Pharaoh goes, oh, Moses, you want to go? Go. It's okay. Go right ahead. And that raises, of course, the very difficult question of God's foreknowledge and human free will. How do people have free will if God already knew hundreds of years before that the Israelites were going to be enslaved and they were going to be liberated by these monumental plagues? Now, we are not going to solve that very difficult theological conundrum here this morning on Thursday Morning Torah, but I want to acknowledge its existence, and it is not so different from the question of hardening Pharaoh's heart, and how is it that Pharaoh has free will if God has injected this, substance that makes him more stubborn than he would be. This substance obviously being non-physical and theological, more stubborn than he would be if God just left the poor guy alone. And of course, it has real consequences for all of Egypt, because the final plague, which we're going to read after this, at the very beginning of Bishalach, is going to be the death of the firstborn, and the death of the firstborn is going to be. I'm sorry. It's 1 second. The death of the firstborn is here. I'm sorry. At the end of Bo, not the beginning of Bishalach, but the end of Bo is the death of the firstborn, and the death of the firstborn, of course, is going to strike all throughout the land of Egypt, and yet it seems as though the death of these firstborn are the moral burden that Pharaoh himself has to carry. Of course, you could say God has to carry it too, since God carries out the plague of the firstborn. But again, we're going to leave that question for another time. And I would say that the answers broadly, though, fall under the category of this is the reality of the leadership of any country. And I'm saying this on January 6th, so I think it has special poignancy, which is that the actions of a leader have consequences for the entire nation. And that's true throughout history and in every society, that you can't have a leader, whether elected or unelected, without the society paying the consequences. And even in dictatorships, and especially sometimes in dictatorships, where the average person has very little say over who rules them, they nonetheless pay a price or accrue a benefit if the person is a good or a bad leader. And this is part of the, I would say, the sort of structural unfairness of life. We all pay a price for the actions of others around us that we don't choose, as they pay a price for our actions. But as I said, this gets us into deep theological waters and deep waters about free will and choice. And I want to move to a particular plague for a particular reason, and leave this aside for the moment, although I acknowledge that there are many unanswered questions in this dilemma of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. I want to talk about the penultimate plague, penultimate being next to last plague, not makat b'chorot, not the killing of the firstborn, but choshech, darkness. And I want to talk about it, first of all, because darkness is unique among the plagues, in that it is the only plague that you would think the Egyptians could overcome. Blood, frogs, vermin, beasts, cattle disease. You can't stop these, right? I mean, if hail is coming from the sky, you can't look up at the sky and say, stop hailing. If you have boils on your skin, you can't all of a sudden make them go away. But darkness, we know how to cure. You light a fire. And so it's very curious that the Egyptians didn't take any measures to combat darkness. That's one peculiarity of the plague. Another peculiarity of the plague, of course, is that the darkness forces the Egyptians, according to the text, to stay in their place for 3 days. Normally, you would not think that darkness would prevent you from moving. It would just make moving tricky and perilous, but that's not what it says. They stayed in their place for 3 days. I think my own memory, and some of you I'm sure will remember this, I will always and forever associate the plague of darkness with the Northridge earthquake, because the quake happened at 4:30 in the morning, 4:31 in the morning, actually. And those of you who've been in an earthquake know the first thing you notice is the sound. There's this gigantic rumbling of sound that wakes you up. And then when the quake hit, and this was before the age of cell phones in the mid-90s, when the quake hit, the first thing that happens is all the lights go out. If there are lights anywhere, all the street lights go out, everything. And it was before people had cell phones. And so unless you had a flashlight, and most people didn't have a flashlight easily available, although after the Northridge earthquake, they did. Unless you did, the world was dark. It was really dark. And there was no easy solution to the darkness except to wait till the sun came up. And it wasn't, I mean, it was in January. So the sun came up probably, I don't know, 6 o'clock-ish, as it does now, 6:15. And in that time, there was a real sense of the world being dark and what it means when the world is dark. It reminded me of there's a book about the Middle Ages written by William Manchester called, and the title of the book is A World Lit Only by Fire, right? A world in which there are no electric lights. There isn't even Zoom, much less than electric lights. And so the plague of darkness, when you start to realize that the entire world is dark and there really is no place you can go, and presumably the stars didn't shine if there was a plague of darkness over Egypt, it brings home in a sort of visceral, emotive way what it is to actually live in darkness. And that leads us perhaps to an answer about why the Egyptians couldn't just light a fire. Because according to some commentators, the darkness was not in the world, it was in the Egyptians. In fact, the Talmud says that it was the thickness of a dinar, which is kind of an ancient coin, which leads me to two separate conclusions about this. You can read about this in my Jerusalem Post column this week. One is that there is an association with the idea that wealth is what blinded the Egyptians to one another, because they had, and obviously the Israelites being slaves did not have. And the second conclusion is the dinar, according to one of the commentators, was like a cataract. That is, it was in their eyes. They were blinded physiologically, not atmospherically. And so they really could not see at all. And they were terrified to get up because they couldn't see, and nobody around them could see to guide them. And so when it says that there was light in the Egyptians, when there was light in all their dwellings, this commentator, the Or HaChaim, says it means there was light in the Egyptians' dwellings, which is how the Israelites could see, but the Egyptians couldn't see it because they're blinded by physiology. The blinding of wealth is also a real thing in that there are all sorts of studies about what wealth does to your ability to see others. It's not that bad people become wealthy, or even that wealth necessarily makes one bad, but wealth does almost inevitably, and I'll explain this in a minute, create a sense of distance between you and others that makes empathy harder. So they've done studies, for example, that the larger the car, the less likely it is to stop for pedestrians. Why? Because you don't feel the pedestrian if you're in this plush, large car the same way that you do if you're on, say, a motorcycle. And this phenomenon of being able to insulate yourself is part of what wealth does, right? You live in a house where others aren't there. Remember, people who still live in communities, you're not sleeping on the street where others are right there. When you travel, you're in a car, you're not in a bus with other people, you're not on a train with other people. And so it makes others less immediately real to you, such that this phenomenon, believe it or not, even takes place, it has been studied, when people are given more money in Monopoly games. The richer you become in Monopoly, the less afterwards you score lower on empathy tests than if you're the loser in the game. And there is something about success and money that makes it harder, not impossible, obviously, because there are wealthy people who are enormously charitable, enormously empathetic, enormously embracing, but it makes it harder to be that way. And therefore, those of us who are economically fortunate have to be aware of that tendency in ourselves, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that poor people give proportionally more money to charity than wealthy people do. Wealthy people give a smaller percentage of their wealth to charity, even though they have more to give. So there are all sorts of social indices that tell you that wealth can do this. And if you're an Egyptian and you have all this money and you have slaves, the chance that you will be able to see those slaves as human beings is much lower than the chance that slaves can see each other and see you as human beings. And therefore, I got a question on Facebook that I'll comment on in a second. And therefore, the connection between darkness and as the penultimate plague, as the plague where this, which is saying to the Egyptians, this is how you are living. You are living without empathy and without vision for the other. Now will you let them go? And finally, when the Egyptians still say no, then comes, of course, the terrible plague of Makat B'chorot, of the slaying of the firstborn. First of all, Jason says, what if the car is driven by a computer like Waymo? I'm sure that the computer that's one thing about the computer, because it has no empathy, it doesn't ever have less empathy, right? So presumably not, unless there's a glitch in the programming, which could be. And Claudia says, "What are there any comparisons to darkness in this and darkness in Bereshit?" The Bereshit isn't exactly darkness. It says there's tohu vavo, which means and there is choshech al pnei tehom. That's true. There is darkness on the face of the deep, but I'm sure there must be, actually, as you say that, there must be some comparisons, but I'm not aware of any. Although I'm certain there are, that's a primeval darkness, and this is a darkness of the plague. But the flip side of this is that there is, in Bereshit, there is a light before the sun. The sun is created on the fourth day, and yet on the very first day it says, "Vayhi or," let there be light. So I assume that both the primeval light and darkness exists, but I don't have at my fingertips the connection. Sandy says Exodus 10:23 supports my view nicely. Right, they could not see one another. Yes. So this inability to see the other, which is, I think, at the heart of let me start this. I was going to say it's at the heart of a religious worldview. There are Jewish philosophers, Buber, and in particular Levinas, the French Jewish philosopher, who unfortunately is not as well known in English-speaking circles, but it's very deep and profound. Levinas makes the face of the other, literally the face of the other, the source of all ethical obligation. It is in seeing the other that you are then commanded to respond. This is a really interesting idea in a world in which you encounter endless others, because if it is the face of the other in the sort of organic communities in which people lived, which meant a village of, 100 people or 200 people, it's one thing. But what do you do when every magazine you turn, every site you go to, every advertisement has the face of the other asking or demanding something of you? This is part of the both glory and difficulty of a modern society, where there are endless others who are beseeching your help, support, so on. I think about this in part because at the end of the year, as I'm sure was true for many of you, I was absolutely deluged by solicitations from charitable organizations. This is part of the problem of giving, is once you give, the list starts getting distributed. And so you get this this bottomless pit of need, and you have to try to decide what you give to and what you don't. How you do that is another really interesting question that we can take up at a different time, although there are certainly organizations that can help you make those kinds of determinations and evaluate charities for what is more and less helpful. But in any case, so what you have now is this existential darkness. That is a darkness that is in some ways the most symbolic of the plagues. I mean, frogs, yeah, but really the darkness that spreads over Egypt. And I think it is fair to say it is the most enduring of the plagues, because we suffer from it as well. And it is almost impossible to not have that darkness enter your life. And also, we can talk about the darkness in terms of the confirmation bias that makes it so hard to see not just the other, but even the views of the other. I think on each side of almost every deep societal divide that we have now, and we have, as you know, several of them, the view of the other is that they must in some way be either ignorant or foolish, because if they were not ignorant nor foolish, they would obviously agree with the way that I see this, but they don't, so they're being blinded in one way or another. And I think maybe part of the overcoming the plague of darkness is to believe in the unblindness of the other, which is difficult to do when it's something that you feel passionately about and deeply about. And I see this constantly. I will have people write me about one thing or another, including, by the way, about Judaism. People who want to convert me and say, if you would just read this, you would discover how wrong you are about whatever it is that I am wrong about. I just had this morning about vaccinations, where somebody said, you know, if you would only realize how wrong you are to promote them, you would be able to overcome this blockage that you have, since all evidence in science is against what you say. I don't agree, but nonetheless, that blindness is a serious social condition, and I think that the plagues lead us to that realization. And in fact, I also want to just mention one other thing that's really fascinating about this, and in a way is one of the ways we overcome blindness. There is a small comment that is almost hidden in the text that is quite remarkable when you think about it. It's, you know, right before the Israelites leave Egypt. What does God tell them to do? Remember that they have to get stuff, right? They go to the Egyptians. It says in chapter 11, the Lord says to Moses, I'll bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt, and after that, he'll let you go. And when he lets you go, he'll drive you out of here, one and all. In other words, he'll really let you go. Now, listen to this. Tell the people to borrow. It says borrow here, but it says vayishalu, which really means to ask. It doesn't necessarily mean borrow. It can be take or ask for them to give you. Each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers objects of silver and gold. Now, the traditional explanation, of course, is that the Israelites have worked for hundreds of years, so this is their just recompense for the labor that they have undertaken, all right? The Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. Moreover, Moses himself was much esteemed in the land of Egypt. Now, that's fascinating. because you could say that once the Israelites asked, then they were seen favorably. And I like that idea of interpretation, although it's, I mean, in the sequence of the verses, it's not entirely clear, but I like that for two reasons. And I want to probably close with these two reasons. One is the idea that the Israelites were standing up for themselves, because remember, they haven't caused the plagues, God has, but now they're actually asking, gives the Egyptians respect. And the second is, once you give something to someone, you tend to think better of them. That is, giving in and of itself helps you see the other. They give, then they esteem Moses. They give, and they're disposed favorably towards the Israelites. At least that's one way of reading the text. I understand you can read it that they were going to do it because God disposed them favorably, and God and they liked Moses. But I want to see it as they gave and then they felt favorably, because I do believe that there's an imbalance that gets a little bit corrected when you give to someone and then you feel a relationship to them that you don't feel before giving. Since giving, as we know, even though it is hard for people to do, it's enormously uplifting to the giver. It matters a lot to someone that they'll give. And that's why I think we don't ask for help or offer help enough. And our lives would be better, seriously, if we did both. Because asking gives someone else the opportunity to give, and giving really does ennoble one's soul and make you feel better about yourself and about the world. So before the final plague, sort of the curative in some ways to darkness is this giving and asking. And I think it's just part of the deep psychosocial wisdom that the Torah gives us, both psychological and social, about ourselves, about our life, and about our world. And with that, next week is Shabbat Shirah, the Sabbath of Song, in Bishalach, when the Israelites actually leave and the Egyptians follow them, and the sea splits. So stay tuned, because there's lots of drama to come. Thank you, and an early Shabbat Shalom.